Let's get going with our next session. We have with us two people, two experts from the Pew Charitable Trusts, who are going to talk about federal spending, primarily how it happens at the state level. And so particularly for those of you who are regional reporters, I think this might be a good way to get a handle on the interplay between federal and state spending. We're first going to hear from Rebecca Thiess, who is a manager of the Fiscal Federalism Initiative at Pew. And then we're going to hear from Colin Ford, who is a manager of the Fiscal Federalism Initiative at Pew. And he's going to be talking specifically about federal spending on natural disasters and how that has changed over time and how it's becoming an increasingly important part of federal spending. We'll hear from each of them, and then we'll have time for questions. So welcome to you both, and I'll turn it over to Becky.
Thanks. Okay, I will share my screen now. Okay, so hopefully you can all see my presentation.
Yep, I can see it.
Perfect. So thanks, everyone. Nice to see you, though really I can just see my PowerPoint now. But thank you so much for having Colin and I here today. We are both with the Pew Charitable Trusts, as Chris said, and Pew is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization whose mission is to inform the public and improve policy. Now, you may or may not be familiar with Pew, but Pew engages in a lot of different types of work. We have a huge environmental portfolio that works on things like conservation, but we also have teams dedicated to issues around finance, the economy, governing, and different aspects of healthcare. So before I dive in, I do just want to clarify a distinction between the Pew Charitable Trusts and the Pew Research Center that you should be aware of in your reporting. The Pew Research Center is a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trusts, and they really focus on conducting polling and demographic research. And they don't engage in advocacy or take any policy positions, but sometimes people do mix up the two, and we are with the Pew Charitable Trusts. And then finally, I'm just going to be showing you some preliminary data today that we haven't published yet. So please keep in mind if you're thinking about writing about these issues, hopefully you can just reach out to us to check and see when that's going to be public. Okay, so Colin and I are here today to talk about the fiscal relationship between the federal government and the states. Let's see if I can move to my next slide. There we go. And then our work really can provide sound research as well as context for you as you're reporting on stories over your careers that touch on any number of topics that have to do with the funding of programs at the state or federal level. So first, I'm going to give you a big picture overview of some of the broad fiscal trends that we study and talk about some of the nuts and bolts of what federal spending means to states. I'll also touch on some of the recent findings that we've seen now that we have a bit of COVID data, which is exciting from a data perspective. That's been terrible for every other perspective. And then in the second half of the presentation, Colin is going to get more specific in, as Chris said, one area that's not only timely, but will continue to be timely, and that's the federal and state funding around natural disasters. So like I said, I'm going to start by talking about the big picture of federal spending in the states. Over 90% of all federal spending happens in the states. So when people talk about federal policies like COVID relief or infrastructure bills, there are always implications for states. And so you all know that in the last 18 months, there have been many major federal packages passed. Money that's gone to people, to states, to support businesses, to support various public health efforts. But I want to give you some background generally on what federal spending looks like in states. It can be helpful to have a sense of what that spending looks like. So first of all, just the small amount of federal spending that doesn't happen in the states is for things like payments on interest on the debt, some foreign aid, and other classified payments. But then the other categories that do go kind of to states fall under things like retirement benefits, grants to states, programs like Medicare and food stamps, contracts for goods and purchases made by the federal government, and then the salaries and wages of government employees. And the pandemic spending that you've seen happen in 2020 and 2021 fall into those categories that I just mentioned. And we know from the research and data analysis that we do at Pew that the federal dollars that flow to states, even in normal years, are a really big part of total resources for states. Okay, so how much of a part of state resources are federal dollars? What you see here is data that we have published showing this breakdown on average of where states get their resources. You can see that the largest percentage, almost half, come from taxes, but that around a third come from federal funds, meaning that about 80% of state resources come from taxes and federal funds together. So of course, that breakdown is different in each state. This is an average of 50 states. But the main takeaway that I hope you have from this is that federal funding is an important source of revenue for states. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is that we can see over time the share of state budgets that come from federal dollars. If you look towards the end of the figure, kind of in the last decade or half decade, you can see that more recently federal funding has hovered at around a third of state budgets. But you can really see in this figure how that trend has looked over the last 5 decades to see the role that federal funding has played in state budgets over time. So again, just to be clear, because I know this can be a little bit of a confusing ratio, this is looking at the funding that states receive from the federal government for services like healthcare, such as Medicaid, transportation, education, and how much those federal dollars make up of total state revenue, kind of when you look at it as a ratio. I think one of the most important, one of the most interesting things about this graphic is the spike you see in 2010 from the Great Recession, where federal revenue going to states was much higher due to recession-related stimulus funds from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. While at the same time, we saw that state tax collections were much lower. And then you can see that 2010 is the highest that this ratio goes in 50 years, as far back as we have data for. What I'll be really kind of interested to see is when we get data for 2020 and 2021, this is census data, and that data is just not out yet. I think we can expect to see another spike because we know that the federal government has had a number of aid packages, which should directly impact this ratio. Now, we also regularly update this data on a state-specific level, which you can find on our website. And I think Margot from Pew may be able to put in the chat the link to where all of these indicators are located on the Pew website. But I'll show you the 2019 map showing state-by-state data now. But what's great is that you can actually get all this in an interactive way and look at it historically. It's set up really nicely on our website. So the takeaway from this map really is that federal grants vary as a share of state budgets. This is 2019 data, and you can see that in some states like Montana, Wyoming, and Louisiana, the landscape is such that federal grants are a high share of revenue in those states, up above 40%. But then in other states like Kansas and Virginia, it's much lower, down closer to 20%. Now, these numbers will be impacted by changes in either state revenue policy or just state tax collections or federal policy changes that may impact this ratio. But I think it's important to just note that a higher or lower percentage doesn't indicate a problem for states. It just really shows a snapshot of how federal dollars are contributing in a certain year to states' overall revenue pictures. So now I want to take just a few minutes to talk to you specifically about grants from the federal government to the states. First, because grants are funding from the federal government that go to support a lot of federal state policy partnerships, such as for health programs, again, like transportation, where you see a strong relationship between the federal government and the states. And then secondly, because grants are how we've been seeing a lot of this money moving from the federal government to the states when you talk about like recession-related relief or pandemic relief, like in the CARES Act or in ARPA. Okay, so what you see in this figure is grant trend data that we are going to be publishing soon, looking at grant levels over the last 12 years relative to pre-Great Recession levels. So even as American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds to states diminished after the Great Recession, which you kind of see that dip in 2011, 2012, grants didn't actually return to pre-Great Recession levels. If they would have done that, you'd see the chart going down to zero. But instead, grants actually experienced kind of a slow, steady rise over much of the last decade relative to pre-Great Recession levels. And our analysis over the years has found that this kind of slow rise has been driven primarily by health care related grants. And then, of course, we've got some 2020 data in this analysis, which is responsible for, or the COVID data is responsible for that huge spike that you see at the end of the chart, which just shows that grant funding is significantly higher in 2020 due to the investments made by the federal government. And then we anticipate that 2021 data, which will include the American Rescue Plan, will only bring that spike higher. And so I want to show you this pie chart, which is that we can actually break down these grants by policy category. So you can see how this funding looks by area. Now, this is really interesting, particularly with COVID related aid in the mix, which is that orange pie slice that you see there. So in 2020, COVID related aid made up 1/4 of all grants to states. Now, in a more typical year, obviously, none of that funding exists. And I'll show you a pie chart from 2019 in just a second, and you'll be able to see that instead of making up half of all grant funding to states, Medicaid is more like 2/3 of all grant funding to states. You can see here Medicaid is 2/3 of that pie slice in 2019. And in 2020, it's half because you've got COVID aid really coming in and taking up a significant share of total grant funding to states. So what I hope the takeaway here is that not only is COVID relief in 2020 a really sizable chunk of all grants flowing to states, but that non-COVID Medicaid remains a huge slice of that pie. What we find with this analysis year after year is that Medicaid really does dominate grants to states. And then at the state level, we interestingly found in 2020 that Medicaid remained the largest share of grant funding to states in all but 8 states. So if you look at 50 state data, Medicaid continues to dominate in most states, even with COVID data in there. And we study these trends to help give reporters like you context around important stories such as pandemic aid to states. As I mentioned, our data so far doesn't yet include the sizable funding passed under ARPA, but we expect trend data to continue to be pretty interesting and for these packages to continue to have major implications at the state level. Okay, so speaking of new data, I just want to touch on the significant federal action that we've seen in the last year and a half. So since the beginning of the pandemic, Congress has passed 6 major pieces of federal legislation in response to the crisis, authorizing over $4 trillion in funding. And just to give you some perspective, $4 trillion is roughly what the government spent in all of fiscal year 2019. And a large portion of that $4 trillion directly benefits states. The 2 largest packages that we've seen were the CARES Act, passed in March 2020, and then the American Rescue Plan, passed a year later. The funding from these bills has been really critical to how states have responded to the crisis and will continue to affect how they plan for the future. And I just think will continue to shape stories that all of you will be working on for years to come. I think it's particularly interesting to look at some of the differences between CARES and ARPA funding that went to states. when you think about the timelines that states have to spend these fundings, or when you think about what states are authorized to use these funds on, and the flexibility that the federal government has provided to states. So for example, states were more restricted with CARES funding, with what they could actually spend it on. And then when you get to ARPA funding, the Biden administration took a different approach. They gave states more flexibility, and states have been able to kind of do different things with that funding this time around. Okay, so just looking at the American Rescue Plan, that plan allocated of that 1.9 trillion, almost 200 billion directly to states. Now you may see the number 350 billion out there. That includes funding for large metropolitan areas, counties, tribes, etc. So 200 billion is what is just going to states from that 350 billion total. And when we looked at this data, we saw that for some states like South Dakota and Wyoming, this aid represents a huge boost for their budgets. It's about 1/5 of what these states spent in fiscal year 2020. Now, in other states, that figure is a lot lower, such as in Oregon and Wisconsin. But even so, this infusion of funding has been enough to offset a lot of the pandemic-driven revenue declines that states experienced. But what this map does, I think, is really show the magnitude of ARPA's reach at the state level, and helps us understand some of the breathing room that this package helped provide for states, especially those that were still dealing with slimmed down budgets from the aftermath of the Great Recession. Okay, so moving forward, there's more federal funding being debated right now, which could continue to really change the picture of funding that the states are getting from the federal government. And as you all know, and as hopefully I've reminded you today, the federal funding that's gone to states has changed dramatically in the last year and a half. But we are going to see more changes, and a lot of that is happening kind of as we speak. And the changes I'm referring to specifically include the infrastructure framework being debated in Congress right now, as well as the budget reconciliation bill. So just first on infrastructure, the Senate has approved and sent to the House a $1 trillion 5-year infrastructure plan, which provides funding for priorities that you've probably been hearing the administration talk about all year: investments in things like broadband, water, energy, transportation projects, and other areas. Now, this Senate bill doesn't provide nearly the amount that the Biden administration had initially requested in the American Jobs Plan, but still, these new investments, even though they're pared down and will probably be passed at a pared down level, will mean significantly more funding for states. And the House is likely to vote on that bill very soon, I believe. Now, on the budget, Congress is using the reconciliation process this time around for work on the fiscal year 2022 budget. Now, this is supplemental to the bipartisan infrastructure package that's moving through Congress, though they are linked. But this procedural process, reconciliation, is being used because it allows the Senate to consider large pieces of legislation with only limited debate, and then, as you may know, requires only simple majority of votes to pass. So the Senate has adopted this FY 2022 budget resolution, and that includes reconciliation instructions to Senate committees to address various aspects of the Biden administration's Build Back Better agenda. And so since we're seeing the Senate really kind of working with the administration in some respects on this package, we may see what they pass ultimately fund policies like Medicare expansion, tuition-free community colleges, or affordable housing initiatives. And these kind of broad sweeping policies that may pass with this budget resolution will definitely impact the level or type of funding that goes to states, as well as the fiscal relationship between the federal government and the states. So that's really it for my broad discussion, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to my colleague Colin to drill deeper on this area where we see this interesting fiscal relationship, and that's on disaster spending. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Becky. So let's turn it over to Colin, and then we'll have time for questions with both of them after Colin is done. So Colin, turn it over to you.
All right, can you guys see the presentation and hear me all right?
Yep, it looks and sounds good.
All right. So everyone, and thanks to Chris and to all of you for the opportunity to talk today. You know, as Becky was saying, we wanted to drill down a little bit on one of the topics that we work on in that federal-state relationship in order to, you know, illustrate not only a timely issue, but, you know, some of the ways that their interplay between the federal and state government kind of play out on a specific topic. And this is a topic, disaster spending, that our team has been digging into for the last 5 years or so. So we have plenty to say on the subject. So I almost feel like I don't need to do these establishing the context slides anymore, because it's just so in our face how frequent and severe disasters are becoming. But to put a little bit of a finer point on it, you know, just this year we had the historic winter storms in Texas, ongoing wildfires, drought, extreme heat in the Western US. We just had Ida hit the Gulf Coast on the anniversary of Katrina, and, you know, spread flooding all through the Eastern United States. And all of those events are stacked on top of the record-breaking events that we had, you know, the year before that we were all talking about, the wildfires, the historic number of tropical storms and hurricanes, all also swirling with, you know, the ongoing pandemic, which is reverberating, of course, through levels of government, local economies, and, you know, all of our lives. So that's really the broad context under which I want to talk a little bit about, you know, this topic, really with 3 things that I want to walk away with. The first is a better, let me go to the next slide, better understanding of the intergovernmental way that we pay for disasters in the US. The second is just the idea that that system is under pressure as we're dealing with more expensive, severe, and frequent disasters. And then really a look at the state level and what the role of states is as part of this story, and how we can start to manage this growing challenge. And before I jump into the content, I did want to acknowledge kind of a key difference in the way that we frame our research versus the way that disasters are often written about or reported on. And that's really that we're primarily concerned with how governments are paying for disaster costs and disaster-related activities, as opposed to focusing on, you know, the disaster's direct impact on an individual, a household, a business. And so while of course our ultimate interest is in, you know, the human impact of this stuff, we really are mostly focused on, you know, that policy level, the structural level, the budget level, when we're talking about disasters today, as opposed to, you know, like how disaster relief is playing out on the ground. So with that, I'll jump right into it with a discussion of, you know, what do we pay for when it comes to disasters and who pays for it? So one way to break that down is to think about disaster assistance in terms of phases of disaster. And those are, I have them up here: response, recovery, preparedness, and mitigation. So I'll talk a little bit about each of those. So response is those activities that are intended to limit loss of life, injury, property damage. So think of search and rescue or emergency sheltering in sort of this category of spending. And I think this is the phase that we're all probably most familiar with from the coverage it gets in the news, the images that we see. But I think what I want to drive home is that this is just one piece of the puzzle if we're going to be talking about the budget impacts or the spending story as it relates to disaster assistance. So moving on to recovery, these are those activities that in the short or long term are meant to return a community to normal or better conditions. So right after the disaster, that could include things like getting the utilities back online, or, you know, cleaning up debris on a road. And then long term, you can think about what goes on for years and decades after the fact, which is really, you know, rebuilding infrastructure or providing loans to homeowners to rebuild their homes that have been destroyed. So in addition to those kind of after the fact disaster related activities that we tend to focus on a lot, we also spend and invest in preparedness. So that's the continuous process of planning for, training, organizing to identify what the threats and vulnerabilities are and what the resources are that we have at hand to deal with them. So things like inventorying state equipment and resources, or doing public awareness and outreach campaigns would fall into this sort of category of preparedness spending. And the final one of the four, and one that we focus on a lot here at Pew, is mitigation. So those are these activities or steps that you can take before a disaster occurs to limit or eliminate the harmful consequences. So think of things like retrofitting a building or a road to be more flood or earthquake resistant, or buying out properties in a flood prone area, building a tornado safe room in a home, or implementing building codes. Those are the activities that we categorize as mitigation. So as you can probably imagine, there's plenty of gray area. You can't neatly put every activity into one of these buckets, and there's a lot of interplay between them. But I want the kind of the takeaway there is just thinking about the diversity of activities and government programs that go into all of these different disaster related things that we're talking about. And one thing, just thinking about you all and reporting on disasters in the future could be to think about what's the story beyond the here and now of the response that we're seeing on the ground. In what ways are these other phases interplaying into what we're seeing? Was there a blind spot in the preparedness? Had the community that's being affected undergone a mitigation project, and how did that play out? And how are we going to pay for the long-term recovery of this community after it's been hit? So just some extra context there, I think, is really important. So that's what we pay for. How about who pays for it? So our disaster assistance system in the US really brings to bear all three main levels of government. So if you think about maybe a smaller disaster, local governments are really that first line of defense, providing their resources and being the first responders. For a more complex or bigger event, state governments can step in with their resources, their equipment, and their wherewithal to try to help the local government out. And when both of those levels of government are overwhelmed, that's when a governor can request a federal disaster declaration, which is the legal mechanism through which states become eligible for the biggest and most important forms of federal disaster aid. And as you can start to picture, as more of these levels of government become involved in a specific event, the more complex and intertwined the funding mechanisms, some of the things like Becky was describing, become to tease out. There's an additional level of complexity here that I like to point out, which is that we often associate disaster FEMA, and that makes sense because it is the main coordinating agency involved in disasters. But it's important to remember that at least 17 major departments and agencies at the federal level are involved in some way in disaster assistance. You see some of them populating there right now. It's a lot, and our analysis has found that between 2005 and 2014, at least, the majority, so 56% of spending on disasters happened in these agencies outside of FEMA. Our research has also found that there's a similarly complex story at the state level. So Florida, one of the states that we've worked with in our research, identified for us 11 agencies, at least at the state level, that were involved in some sort of disaster activity. You can see the diversity of those agencies up there. So again, I think what I'd highlight here is that whether you're writing about an individual disaster or bigger policy questions around climate, there's a lot more to the story than what's going on with FEMA, even though that's obviously really central to this discussion. There are many things happening in other parts of the federal government, other parts of state government, and there's kind of an inherent story to the fact that you have these dozens of agencies all trying to solve similar problems and address some of the same issues with coordination in some cases and not so great coordination in others. So at this point, I'm going to transition from this discussion of kind of introducing the system and how we pay for things to kind of the state of play of what's going on with the federal-state relationship as it relates to disasters, particularly in this context that we're seeing of more frequent and severe events. So one way the pressure that we're seeing shows up is in rising spending. So based on the kind of moving parts that I just described, you can imagine that it's pretty difficult to pinpoint an exact dollar amount of what the federal government spends on disasters if it's happening, all over government. But GAO has done the valiant effort of estimating that at least $460 billion federal dollars have been spent on disasters since 2005. We've done some analysis of FEMA's public assistance program, which is their largest program, and found an almost 25% increase in that program spending if you compare decade over decade. If you also want to think about where this rise in federal spending is being spent, before the pandemic, all 50 states in DC had a federal major disaster declaration. Now, because of the pandemic, all states are operating under one of those declarations. But the reason I bring this up is that if we're thinking about this, rising spending, more frequent disasters, it's not just a Louisiana, Texas, Florida story, not to pick on those states, but they're the ones we think of as disaster prone. This is really something that's happening all over the country. And thinking about those federal state dynamics, I think the thing to take away is that a rising federal price tag has not been lost on federal policymakers. So we've really seen a message from administrations going back to the Obama administration, from Congress, from these watchdog groups like GAO and inspectors general, that the federal government is spending too much. GAO has had, the federal government's fiscal exposure on its high risk list for years. The idea being that federal government is spending too much, and more responsibility, more of these costs should be shouldered by state and local governments. I would say that message has come in fits and starts because we keep having these big disaster events that then result in a big federal response. But you can trace this sort of message and a policy shift over the years that's been persistent about adjusting the responsibility of who pays for disasters. So for the purposes of today, I'll put those into two categories in terms of the policies from the federal level. The first is essentially making it harder for states to get that declaration in the first place that provides the federal funding. So raising the threshold at which they become eligible. FEMA is working on regulations that would do just that. As you can imagine, states are very opposed to that in most cases. So that's something to keep an eye on when those regulations eventually either come out or to see what the administration does with those. The second category, and I mentioned before, we worked a lot on this at Pew, is encouraging using either carrots or sticks, investment in those mitigation activities that could help reduce the impact of future disasters. So just some examples I have here are FEMA's new Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. There are mitigation aspects to the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure bill that Becky was discussing. And while these examples appear to be, the federal government just giving states money to deal with this, some previous policies were also trying to tie access to federal funding to states proving that they had made these types of smart investments with their own funds in the past. So quickly, I think I just want to highlight that inherent in this whole discussion is a question about what is the role of states. And so just based on what I've said, you can surmise that states are really involved in those disasters that don't receive a federal declaration. They're spending their funds for that. And even for those instances when they do receive federal funds, the way that those grant programs primarily are designed is such that state and local governments pay upfront and are then partially reimbursed by the federal government. So you do have state funding involved in all of these situations. And so really what I want to highlight for this group is that the federal policies that I was discussing before and the debate over who should pay for what was really, it really has inherent in it the idea that states aren't doing enough or that states are making the wrong choices about what to do with their funds. And where Pew's research has really tried to step in is making sure that that's based on evidence. So really trying to understand that state role, understand what states are spending and what that looks like. So I'll just briefly talk about one of our research projects, which was looking at tracking disaster spending. We asked states to provide us with information about what they had spent on their disaster costs over a 5-year period. And we did get some data, but the real takeaway was that states were not tracking that information. So it was very difficult for them to put a number to the problem if we're talking about what are you spending on disasters. Like I said, we were able to collect some data which showed wide variation in how much states were spending and what they were spending on, which in turn you can imagine has implications. If the federal government changes its policies, that's going to affect your state in one way while it affects state B in another, which is why we've been really pushing both states and the federal government to really prioritize tracking and accounting their disaster spending. The idea there being you can't manage what you don't track. We have this rising spending that we perceive. We have this dynamic between levels of government where there's a debate over who's responsible for what, and we don't really have a good sense of the money going out the door as a consequence of those dynamics. I'm going to hit mitigation one more time before we finish up because it is really important. One of the ideas that we try to get through is that you can't mitigate what you don't track. So a better sense of how much we're spending on disasters, both at the federal and state level, is really important if we want to find the resources or identify the resources that could be more strategically allocated in ways that could reduce our costs over time. I think I don't have a bullet about this, but I was thinking about it. I think thinking about mitigation is also very emblematic of the shift in thinking that's happening both in the emergency management world and the climate world, that disasters aren't just something that happen every once in a while that we need to respond to. There's something that we're living with that we have to plan for and that we have to figure out how we become more resilient to. And I think one statistic that gets thrown around a lot, which is great, from the National Institute of Building Sciences, is that $1 in mitigation investment can save $6 in post-disaster recovery costs. We've sliced and diced that data from National Institute of Building Sciences to look state by state, found consistency that even though there's a range in that return on investment, it's still at least threefold, even in the lowest state, which in this case was California. So I'll wrap it up there. I mean, I'll just throw the takeaways back up there, which is that this is really a complicated relationship with a lot of agencies and levels of government involved, and that those intergovernmental tensions will continue to be there as we're facing more severe disasters, and those events are becoming more costly. And we think from the Pew perspective, I know this is a Washington-focused group, but the state role and that interplay between the federal government and the states is really key to understanding how we can manage this into the future. So with that, I can stop sharing, I think, and Becky and I can both answer any questions.
Colin, thank you very much. So we have plenty of time for questions. We'll go to Orion first.
Thanks, guys. I think this is probably more for Colin, but I'm curious what either of you guys think. I've been doing a bunch of stuff on FEMA, both individual assistance and public assistance, how those decisions are made, mainly because we just had an anniversary, one year mark after a wildfire that destroyed a couple of towns in Eastern Washington. And that because President Trump at the time was feuding with Governor Inslee, he held up the decision whether on the major disaster declaration. So it's an unusual case, but after all that, when Biden came into office, he approved PA and denied IA. And just getting that message from FEMA that this disaster was not of sufficient severity to warrant that was really frustrating for people there, obviously. But something that struck me was that I guess learned in that process was Washington State, and I imagine other states, don't really have an equivalent to FEMA individual assistance, like some cash assistance program or something that can fill that gap in the aftermath of a disaster. Have you guys found anything on that, like nationwide? How is that something that states are working on? Do you think there should be some change in the way that the country manages recovery on an individual basis, not just in terms of like public infrastructure?
It's a good question, or set of questions. I would say on the first piece about state level individual assistance, that is something that we asked states about as part of our request for information on state spending that we did for this report that was published in 2018. One of the points of variability that we point out in that report is whether or not they have their own IA program or individual assistance program. I'm not going to be able to judge off the top of my head exactly which states did what, but maybe Margot can drop that report in the chat, because one of the dynamics that we were trying to point out there is, say FEMA decides to reward states that are investing in their own IA program. If your state has one that's been around for years and is well funded, that's great for you. If you're a state that has not done that, that's not so great, right? So that's what we're trying to raise awareness around, some of those state-by-state variability issues there. And I am not going to remember the second part of your question now that I went down that road. But
sorry, it was not a well put question. I guess the second thing would just be if you see some, there may be or ought to be some kind of comprehensive change in the way that states handle disasters as we see this kind of thing happening. I was struck by, Biden recently granted IA for the Dixie Fire, or I guess 4 counties in Northern California. Obviously, that was a huge fire. But, in the West, we have a lot of fires that aren't maybe on their own burning 1 million acres, but destroy entire towns. So I just wonder if I'm curious to see more what you guys, I'll look at what you guys have found, but if states are making that kind of effort, that kind of change across the board.
I think I'd point to 2 things. The first is that the way that those determinations are made, whether a state will qualify for public assistance or individual assistance, FEMA has a somewhat complex way that they come up with a recommendation of what that determination should be. There's something like 6 factors that they look at and they weigh. You might know this already from what you're discussing, but it's ultimately up to the president, right, to use his or her discretion to decide whether to make that declaration, which is part of I think you were talking about with the change in administration. One of the things that is now involved in the individual assistance determination is a state's is like a fiscal measure of what the state fiscal impact is. So I think if anything, we'll probably see more of that because in the recent, I alluded to the rulemaking that's happening at FEMA about public assistance. They're also trying to tie in some sort of state fiscal measure to that. So not answering your question directly, but I think the intertwined nature of state fiscal capacity to deal with these things and FEMA's decision making about whether or not they're going to provide assistance to a state is becoming more intertwined. And then another state level thing that I would point out is that there is a rise in statewide resilience planning efforts that's happening across the country, whether that's under the aegis of a chief resilience officer or some other structure. States are starting to look at how they can pull together the resources that are happening, the efforts that are happening around the state, and be more planful and strategic about that. And that's something one of our teams at Pew has been looking at quite a bit as it relates to flood, sort of pulling together the brain trust of folks across the country that are working on those statewide resilience efforts and seeing how that can be built upon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, and Orion is from the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Tia, did you still have a question?
Rebecca, you were talking about the resources at Pew when it comes to tracking how federal dollars are divided among the states or what the different states receive. And I was wondering if you or Colin have ideas about, for me, it's not just finding what actually happens, but understanding the implication. I work for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, understanding the implication for states as to what's being proposed. For example, with the reconciliation package that's being, crafted, and you had Biden put out his plan, but it's like, it's hard to break down what does that mean by state when it comes to, expanding Medicaid or changing the benefits for Medicare. But then the House did its own plan, and now I'm really like, I can't even compare and contrast the two. Do you all have any thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are there are resources out there, and I hear what you're saying, because a lot of what our information does is take the latest data available about what has happened. So often what we're publishing is 2019, 2020, just depending on the data sets that we have available. But yes, in terms of what's being proposed, how do you figure out what that actually may mean? There are different resources that I can think of off the top of my head. I'll probably think of more after this call ends, but if you go to the committees, like the Senate committees, the House committees, they do sometimes have spreadsheets where they will have, okay, well, these are the dollars that are actually going to flow to each state from this specific proposal. I know on health related issues specifically, I really like the Kaiser Family Foundation, which puts out a lot of good analysis and a lot of good state by state data that's very timely. We use their data sets, as well as MacPac, which I'm not going to remember what that stands for right now, but it's like MACPAC for things like proposed Medicaid matching rates by state, any kind of bump ups that those might have. And I think that they will do CHIP as well as the big health, Medicare, Medicaid. We rely heavily on federal funds information for states data sets, which is a subscription service, but your news organizations may have subscriptions to it. So the website is ffis.org. They probably have some information that's not behind a paywall, but they do collect a lot of state specific data on a very timely level about things like the president's budget proposal, for example, and you'll be able to see kind of state by state and issue by issue data there. But did that answer your question, or go ahead?
I can just add a few more thoughts. Like, I would definitely echo what Becky says, that in terms of the type of analysis she was sharing, for us, that's going to be mostly ex post facto, look backs. The other place that we, tap into, though, to stay on top of the type of question that you're asking is the national membership organizations for state officials. So be that National Conference of State Legislatures, National Governors Association, National Association of State Budget Officers. Who am I forgetting? There's also there's like the treasurers.
Actually, the counties do great.
The counties,
yeah,
yep.
NACO.
Government Financial Officers Association, like the whole alphabet soup of these, DC-based state membership organizations are really, they have a finger on the pulse of, what federal policies are going to affect your state. Whether that translates into, what specific funding is going to go to Georgia might be trickier, but that's another resource that I would point out.
Okay, let's go to Courtney.
Hi guys, thank you for being here and for talking to us today. I work for the Washington Post, but my question is about So some time ago, and I don't remember exactly when, the state of Louisiana started reallocating some of their emergency funds towards relocation for the coastal communities that were being flooded by the levees. And I'm wondering if you guys are tracking any of the data about how states might be reallocating more money towards relocation specifically, or whether that's something that, as we're seeing more natural disasters and climate change impacting states, if that's going to be, create kind of a jump in that change of funding sources for emergency management.
It's a good question. And also I will cite our flood prepared communities colleagues as well. And, I can also get you in touch with them if you have specific questions. They're about to come out with a research report on buyout programs, which are, very closely tied to what you're saying. I don't have anything specific about how states are reallocating federal funds, but I do think there's a tie there to, if states are spending their own funds versus federal funds, they can spend their own funds how they want. Federal funds come with a whole set of, strings and requirements they would have to follow in order to make those types of decisions about how they want to allocate their resources. And then the only other tangential thing that I would add is just thinking about the big tranches of money that are coming out of the federal government to pay for mitigation, which often includes buyouts or relocation. So thinking about what's in ARPA that is permissible for certain activities like that. The BRIC program that I mentioned before, the decision by the administration to make to tie the COVID declarations to mitigation money, meaning that it opens a lot of extra mitigation money there. So just there's a lot of money flowing right in this space, and could be interesting to see what states do with it. But certainly we can throw actually the website up, hopefully for the flood prepared communities team, so you can follow that more specific.
Becky, one of your charts was showing the federal grants as a share of states' budgets. And in light of the fact, and I'm wondering if there's a red-blue divide in states that are run by Republican governors and state legislatures and those that are run by Democrats. Is there a divergence in those trend lines? I'm just thinking of the states that refused to take the Medicaid expansion. Did that have a material impact on how much money they were effectively losing out on? And are there other programs like that where Republican governors are saying, we don't want that money?
Yeah, that's a great question there. And I'm happy to throw the map back up and share my screen again if folks would like. But I think the short answer is that there are a lot of different inputs that go into that ratio. So I don't think that we see necessarily a red-blue divide or these ratios depend on, the legislature, who's in power. For example, states like North Dakota, which have just seen in some years a ton of money from their kind of the various environmental mining activities that they do. That will really bring that ratio way down because they have more funding coming from these other sources, which means that the share of federal funding is less. Then of course you've got other states which may have a larger percentage of their population qualify for programs like Medicaid, which of course has both a federal and state component. So you may see more federal funds flowing to those states. So that will depend on even just the makeup of that state's population and income levels. But then yes, as you pointed out, the Medicaid expansion has definitely had an impact. Yes, very interestingly, I think we've all seen articles over the last number of years about these internal debates that states are having and people saying, well, you're leaving this money on the table. But Medicaid funding from the federal government to states that have chosen to expand have really driven federal grants to states, especially because initially the federal government covered 100% of those expansion costs. Now that has pared down. I think it's now all the way down to 90% with states that have expanded shouldering 10% of those costs. But yes, I do think that in states that have expanded Medicaid, they have seen an influx of federal funding related to Medicaid. So yeah, thanks for asking that.
Another question from Orion.
You guys are talking about the resiliency funding. We've seen a lot of that. I know through both the infrastructure bill and rescue plan. Have you noticed any interesting trends in terms of especially wildfire mitigation, fuels reduction, forest management stuff that would be worth a story or worth looking into?
I wouldn't be able to say in terms of trends. I do think that you've lit on something that we're very interested in, which are some of the distinct features of wildfire in particular, as it relates to other, or as it contrasts to other types of disasters. So we're actually in the process of a research project that's looking at the federal and state spending components to wildfires in particular. As you probably know, you have very different federal agencies involved in a lot of wildfire issues at USDA, at Department of Interior, with FEMA stepping in more in the recovery sphere, as you've mentioned. But it's hard to say in terms of the money coming out now, what those trends would be. I might point you to the announcements around the first round of the BRIC program, so FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, to see what, if any, wildfire projects got funded. There has been a conversation for a number of years about the inability to apply certain FEMA mitigation money to fire issues that folks have tried to remediate legislatively, and now I think in terms of the types of awards that they grant in those competitive mitigation programs. So I would check there to see if there are any fire projects on there, and off the top of my head, I can't think of it. But it's certainly a topic that's of interest to us, particularly as it relates to what we're spending on it, right? If you're a Western state, how is the frequency and the severity of these wildfires affecting your state budget? Who's paying for it, et cetera.
Quickly, I'm sorry if I missed this, but you mentioned the proposed FEMA rulemaking on PA. Do you have any sense of where that's heading, when we might get a decision?
I don't. The comment period ended in the first quarter of this year, and I haven't heard anything since then.
Any other questions? I have one very short one for Colin. It surprised me when you said that since 2015, every state has had a federal declaration. I mean, outside of the fires and the hurricanes, I mean, what are some of these other ones that aren't making national news? It's local flooding stories or things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, severe storms, flooding events, high winds. FEMA actually does a good job of having that data available on their website. If you're ever curious, or writing a story or have a state angle, you can go to FEMA.gov and pull the declaration information for what declarations are active by state, that type of information. They've done a lot of work it's called Open FEMA is their data set, to pull that type of stuff. But to sort of build on that, Chris, I think when I'm talking about FEMA wanting to shift costs to states, it's in that category of these smaller disasters that, in the federal government's view, states should be able to shoulder without federal assistance. I don't think they think that a Sandy or a Katrina or a big catastrophic event should be just leave that to the states. I think they continue to see themselves in that role for catastrophic events, but how do they get out of the business of being active in 50 states at once? for some of these smaller events that perhaps states and locals could be better prepared for.
Okay, thank you. All right, any final questions from the fellows? All right, Colin and Becky, I want to thank you both very much for coming. Great presentations. We'll get the fellows your slide decks, which are packed with information. And thanks, Margot, for sending along those links. I'll also be posting those links when we write a story about this session and post a transcript and things like that.